Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Jared Drake. I'm a first year ARM student. And I'll just move quickly and talk about what prompted me to share this article. I came across this article in mid-January on NPR, and the article was titled, "This app was made for walking, but is it racist?" And immediately, as I read the article, I thought that it was something that I would be better informed discussing with my peers here at SI. So I actually just, to talk about the article mentions that individuals were interested in an application that could help them sort of forecast an area that they are not necessarily familiar with. And actually after rereading the article, one aspect of that forecast is actually about weather and like unfamiliar like landscape, which is something that actually I missed the first time I read the article. But chiefly it talked about how to avoid crime and dangerous neighborhoods and that sort of thing. And as someone who's from a city that actually gets a lot of negative publicity in Northwest Indiana for its crime statistics, I thought this is something that as information students and as professors of information is something that we could enhance each other's knowledge base about. So I sent the article actually with a lot of hesitance. I didn't know how people would react. I didn't know if I'd get any responses. And if you're on the SI All Open, you saw the hundreds of responses garnered. The dialogue that I initially started was actually with another student, and it was a private dialogue. And he and I had a very good conversation, and we said, you know, why are we having this conversation amongst ourselves? We should really make sure that everyone sort of gets in on this conversation. So that's how we arrived here today.
Just an observation. I don't know why there's 4 faculty members up here and you all out there. It's not, in my opinion, the case that we know what this is about and you don't. This is an interactive discussion, I think. That's the idea behind it. Some of us participated in this thread. I just did a little bit of a quick analysis. There were, depending on how you count, 40 or 44 messages in this thread on SI Open, all open, whatever it is. And that's up there. That's up there. Some of the other ones that have been around recently, like the one that's going on now about the homeless hotspots at South by Southwest, has had 30 postings on it. It may hit the number that this one got, but that's up there. 40 is up there. So it's interesting that this distribution list has become a kind of forum for ethical issues. And that suggests to me that this is an important, broad topic. I don't think any of my colleagues in this panel disagree with me on that. But there is a question of how the school best handles this, and that's something we might come back to. In the meantime, I'll leave it at that. You know, something you want to say, Jenny?
Well, it seems to me one of the main issues that we need to talk about in all of this is whether or not you as SI professionals have responsibilities to design software, design databases, design information flow processes with strong ethics behind you. Whether you need to think about that, whether you need your design to reflect strong ethical values, or whether you see technology as totally neutral and you develop it based on what it can do and let the devil be in the details. And so I think that's an important piece of discussion we ought to be having about this.
And I think I'll stop there because I want to make sure that there
make a point to note that there are some things that are actually, there's something that could be, let's say, unethical or even something that may be offensive. And just because something is offensive in terms of technology use doesn't inherently mean people can't do it or shouldn't do it. And so there should be some line between someone being offended and what's ethical and what something or what someone should be allowed to actually do, right? So we shouldn't confine everything we design to make sure that everyone's not offended before we design something, right? So I think we need to broaden the discussion to accept the fact that a lot of things are going to offend us, and a lot of things are going to make us uncomfortable, but that in itself is not a reason that makes it either unethical or for some reason it shouldn't be done. So I think that's where I would like to participate in the overall discussion. Paul?
Well, I'm coming at this from two perspectives. One is well, first I should precondition my comments by saying I didn't see the thread, and I'm not subscribed to SI All Open. And when I went to try to find the thread, turns out we don't archive our lists or preserve them. So this is what Jay is doing here is the record of what is, so that be a motivator for raising the most critical issues. So there may be 40 of this and 30 of that, but after tomorrow they don't exist. I'm coming at this from the perspective of teaching. I teach one of the core required courses for the undergraduate informatics program, which is a collaboration between the School of Information, the LS&A, and engineering. And it's a course called Ethics in Information Technology, in which I'm working with a set of philosophers who are exploring the ethical implications of new technologies, the moral and ethical implications. And the whole purpose of the course is to kind of look at the big meta question is there anything different about technology that forces either new ethics, new ethical behaviors, new policies, or is it just new ways of doing or challenging us to to think in ways, new ways to think about problems that have been our age old. So theft is theft, anonymity is anonymity, privacy is privacy. It just works in a different context. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. The one point I wanted to put on the table that when I was able to read the article in NPR is one of the key issues that we teach in ethics and information technology is the fundamental importance of transparency as a precondition for ethical thinking, ethical behavior. And it seems that part of the problem with this app is that nobody really understands how it works. And it's a lot of what Google does is not transparent. They're a company renowned for its lack of transparency in pretty much everything that they do. If it isn't patented by Google, it doesn't exist in the open information marketplace. So maybe if we knew what data sources and how that data was acted upon and what options the user had to tailor or craft or adjust the app to meet their own particular needs, then we wouldn't be having this particular conversation. How do crime statistics work together with geospatial data, together with weather data to steer people away from bad neighborhoods? I mean, if we knew, so if transparency is kind of a fundamental foundation upon which all of this seems to exist.
One of the things I wanted to bring up with respect to transparency is that in addition to transparency is understanding what that means. You can have the information available that Google is using, that some other kind of aggregator or compiler is using, and is that any good to you if you don't understand what it means and how they're using it as well? Are there ethical concerns that we need to be aware of when a Google or a Microsoft or some other company like that is creating these aggregators? We have a body of information that some app developer is assigning some value to. How do we know what this value is, and if someone is using that app, how that value translates?
Well, along that line also, the question comes, Lisa, how do we know how that information was collected in the first place and for what purpose? I happened to be part of the university many, many years ago when we had student information in the directory, the hard paper directory, and presumably the students gave us that permission to put their name in the directory, the purpose being to share with each other in this community, to be able to connect with each other. That was its primary purpose. And when the technology became available for us to share that more widely, to put it on the web, for instance, I can remember the discussion was, well, it's public, and therefore we can put it on the web. And without any more thinking than that, we went from a paper directory in this community to the full information being on the web available to everyone. And it was only a short time before we started hearing from people who had restraining orders against individuals who were from particular international groups that did not want others in their country to know they were here. All kinds of things that we would never have thought about in a million years. But that discussion didn't take place as to what was its original purpose for being collected, what kind of permissions did we have for doing it, and I would relate that to this app. What is the reason that we have criminal information? Is it to tell me what neighborhoods I should or shouldn't go into? I don't believe so. And who defines a bad neighborhood? And what's the effects of being restricted in some way from going into that neighborhood on the neighborhood itself? You know, what's my obligation to be in that neighborhood and to both realize that not everybody in that neighborhood is dangerous and that I am not afraid of every single place in this country that might be labeled by somebody else as dangerous. So the primary purpose, its secondary use for me are big, huge issues. And the discussion that goes around that kind of second use of data and how clean those data are to start with, let alone in a secondary use. To me, those are really critical issues.
I think you can take it and turn it around. I flew into different areas before, different cities, and I go to the hotel front desk, and then they tell me where to go and where I shouldn't go. All the time. Don't go this part of town because it's too dangerous. So that information was always there. Now, I can make a counter argument that if it's based upon some facts, I can check out the facts to see if it's actually valid, but that may be more reliable than having someone at the hotel tell me, don't go over here, or don't go over there. Because at that point, I don't know why I shouldn't go over there, right? So, I mean, you can make the counter argument that providing information based upon some type of facts could actually maybe make a lot of more of these neighborhoods more accessible than they have been in the past.
I think the first thing is, you, Lisa?
Yes.
Brought up the concept of even if you have access to the data, it doesn't matter if you don't know what it means. And I think that when you're talking about digital literacy, it is hugely important. And I also think that if you are digitally literate and you can understand these things, it is, and you find something offensive and you say this is wrong, it is your obligation to stand by that. I dislike this idea of, well, each to their own. If you find something and you think it's unethical, as in it shouldn't, like it's not okay that somebody has put this out there, then you should take a stand and say that. And you should really stand up for that, because if everybody did that, if everybody said, well, I don't like this, but each to their own, there would be a whole bunch of really unethical things out there, and there probably are, right? And we should not allow that to the extent that we can, number one. Number two, there's a difference between walking up to somebody in a hotel room or in a hotel counter and then a sort of institutional, yeah, exactly. So like this app is distributed to a much wider market than a personal conversation between somebody behind a desk at a hotel and you. And I think you really have to take into account, the way it feeds into institutional values and beliefs that maybe we don't really want to confront and deal with. And so especially in an app like this one, right, especially in an app like this one specifically, I think a major question is, beyond digital literacy and responsibility, is to what extent does this enable institutional racism, right? This is the app racist. To what extent is this app allowing the institution to continue to, what's the word, perpetuate discrimination and racism. And I think that's really important, and that we ought to the extent that we can, we ought to speak up about it. We ought to say, no, you should not do this. No, we should hold you responsible.
I think that's a really good comment, but I want to tell you, I would be offended if somebody said to me at a desk, don't go someplace, because I don't know them, I don't trust them, they don't know me, they don't know what I'm capable of doing or what I'm interested in seeing. So, I mean, I think we can apply that all the way down, but I agree with you in terms of the institutional perpetuation.
So it sort of seems like maybe these aren't new ideas. What Professor Conway was sort of saying, these are issues that have occurred throughout history. So in dealing with unknowns in this medium, what are some steps that we as information professionals can take in order to respect how we explore how these issues come up now? Like, are there heuristics in place? Are there ways that, or methods that researchers have used to determine whether something is ethical?
Well, I mean, so if you can imagine these guys that come up with the apps, or girls, and someone says, hey, we got a problem. We got people who go into new towns and they get robbed, they get murdered, they get so forth. Is there any way that we can help these people? And someone says, well, no, I have an idea. We can develop an app that can map where all these crimes take place, so that way when people are in new cities, they can avoid these high crime areas. Okay? I don't think at that point someone's going to stop and say, well, is this ethical or not? I think these apps like this are initially started and begin to help people. And I can see how they get interpreted, and I can see how they can have negative impacts, but I can see someone trying to solve a problem, right? Make something better. And so I think we should look at it from that standpoint. I'm not sure if someone in that conversation would have inherently said, wait a minute, is this ethical? Is giving people information that's public on crime stats, is that ethical? I mean, I'm not really, I can see it having negative social impacts, and we should discuss that, but I'm not sure it's unethical.
Yeah, there are design methods in systems design under the umbrella of value-sensitive design that embodies a set of methods. Value-sensitive design is the approach. It's kind of like taking the evaluation of systems and services approach that is offered in SI 622 and add an ethical values component to the investigation. And there is a literature, and there are research methods that are trying to add value investigation into systems design that involves people and systems use. So it's out there. We don't necessarily teach it specifically in the School of Information, but it's a line. I mean, if you Google or whatever, Yahoo, who uses Yahoo anyway? Value-sensitive design. You'll get there, and I brought some books that have references in there. But it starts with asking different questions.
I think
Does it work?
I think we have to even go back one step further. We have to understand what the driver is for the development of the app. Is it the technology and the capability of doing it that drives us? In other words, hey, look, we can put this database together with this database and that database, and we can have all this now available to us. Is that the driver? Or is it, which I think is a wonderful motive that you've stated, I'm not sure I agree that it often occurs, saying here's a problem that we want to solve, and it's a problem that we want to put forward with a technological solution to make life better for people, a beneficence rather than a malfeasance, right? So I'm not sure what the driver is, and I think we have to ask that question first. And then the second thing is there really a difference in technology ethics or ethics connected with technology? Does technology make any difference? Is it neutral? Or are there aspects of the technology itself that require us then to look at the ethical implications of whatever combination we're putting together? And I would throw out to you speed, depth, spread, duration to think about.
Let me just make one point. A key distinction between being a professional and being an literate person is that a literate person can say, beats me, when they ask, what do you think we should do? But a professional can't. When a professional is asked, what do you think we should do about this? There's an expectation the professional will say something like, I think we should do this, or I think we should think about it this way. So that's That's a key thing for people who are being educated in a program like this one, which has at least ostensibly professional objectives. You know, how do you know what to do? What you do and what you say are two different things. You're entitled to your opinion, of course. But it's another thing when you say, my opinion now informs my advice, because there's a warranty implied with that advice. So the question, I mean, I think it's a good question. How do you deal with questions like this? Is a very, very serious issue.
I'm actually genuinely curious to understand how is this app any different from the documentation that the government puts out warning people when they're traveling internationally in certain areas in the world.
I think Virginia mentioned it when she said you're adding speed and depth and how it's applying to more people, because it's taking that information that is available but distributing it.
But it's still at the end of the day information and it's still distributed.
Yeah, some guidebooks. This isn't new.
Yeah, I'm wondering if the, I mean, I think I kind of agree with her. I think it's quite similar to that. You know, you get these warnings by the State Department every day on where you should travel to this country or that country. I think it's quite similar. I think maybe, you know, I would wonder if we took out the issue of race, right? Because we all have this image in our head of this app telling people who are white, don't go to the side of town that's black. Right? That's what we have in our head. I mean, even though it hasn't been said, that's the underlining theme, right? And we say, well, that's wrong. But if you turn it around, let's imagine that you go, I'm a black man, I go to Ireland. I don't know Ireland, all right? I land in the city in Ireland. And I use the app, and the city is all white. I mean, wouldn't I want to know what places I may want to avoid or I maybe should avoid? And in that context, is the app still racist?
Actually, that was where I was thinking on, and I agree with the fact that if the information, if the basic purpose of the information is to sort of make your experience as safe as possible for you, I don't see how it can be racist. And the fact that we're predisposed to thinking a certain way, it's our problem, not the information.
It all depends on the quality of the data and what data is being used. So supposedly there's a caliber of some sort when the government says this country is now of danger for you, right? We need to know what that caliber is. What are they using and based on what data? Likewise, this application. Their hands, yes.
No, you were all
Okay. Well, the racial makeup of the United States is very different from other countries. And the way I think, you know, like, don't go to this country right now because it's under war, like, it's not the same as, like, don't go to this neighborhood because of these reasons. I feel like fundamentally that is a very different set of guidelines people are using within the country and foreign. I don't think when we think about Ireland, where, like, you know, the Catholics and whatever other, you know, people are fighting, like, I don't think we think of it in terms of race. Like, in the United States, I think it is laden, maybe inappropriately with that dialogue, but I guess, like, how do we go forward from that to determine whether this information is neutral or used properly?
You've already identified some calibers, right? Some measures, some variables. Race, religion, as you went through that war. Okay, supposedly we understand what the caliber is that somebody is saying, what the variable is, but we don't in this case, and we don't in many cases. Lisa?
I was also going to say that in this country, there's also the component of socioeconomic issues as well, which has to be considered, and there are some assumptions that go along with that, particularly when you say the term inner city. There's a picture that comes up for most people, and there's a socioeconomic component to that. Occasionally, there's a racial component that comes to that, and those types of parameters color this discussion, whether we like it or not. As enlightened as many of us are, as liberal as this campus is, it is a microcosm of who these avid adults are trying to reach. And that's something that we have to take into consideration. So I agree with you that it is similar in how the government puts out these warnings about these different areas to travel to, but the basis for that is a little different than what an app aggregator is doing. When the government, again, like Dr. King said, when the government puts out a parameter, there's an understanding that we lend certain credence to it. I don't know what these app developers have as their establishment credence, other than that they put together this app that aggregates this crime data, which may or may not be accurate in and of itself. So, again, it brings up a lot of uncomfortable questions and things that people don't want to talk about, but as information professionals, we do have a responsibility. We put some measure of trust in creators of data that we use and that we assemble to make our lives easier. What validity do they have, other than that they're able?
Here's one. You have a sexual predator list that's expanding, right? So we could develop an app that simply said, don't buy a house in this area if you have children beneath the age of 8. Okay, so you have to do some thinking about that. Quality of the data, purpose for which the data was collected, purpose of the app. Okay, there's a hand back there. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick follow-up on your point. I mean, I think public urination and streaking would put you on that registry. So, I mean, I think this has direct parallels to this consciousness of how we think about crime and how we construct crime in the society and how we deploy the police. And so, for me, we really do need to talk about race as much as we talk about technology. We're kind of missing the race part.
Can I just point out an important distinction here? There's sort of two discussions going on. One of them is the behavior of app writers, and the other one is intent. Now, Michael Cohen, a member of our faculty, unfortunately until the end of this year, when he retires, wrote a paper many years ago on the garbage can model of decision making, a very important paper. And if Michael were here, he would probably dispute my 2-second characterization of it. But basically what it said was decisions get made as a result of 3 reasons. Problems looking for solutions, solutions looking for problems, and decision makers looking for work. Okay? So think of app developers as magpies. They like shiny things, right? And to an app developer, a shiny thing is a database, right? And there's a database of FBI type 1 crimes that occurs for every jurisdiction. This is an attractor to an app developer because you can do something with a database and linking it up with geospatial technology and so forth. And that's where this app came from. I seriously doubt whether the application developers, in this case, had any idea that they would be unleashing this discussion. They probably thought, wow, look at this database, this is cool. I could connect it with this and that would be cool. And then I would have an app and that would be cool. And then we have the app, right? And then we have this discussion.
Yeah, I kind of wish we would take these discussions on a much broader level. You know, we look at everything in America in terms of in America, and people are black and white, and we have this sort of, as our context in viewing these type of discussions. And I think that's okay, I guess, but it's kind of outdated, right? I mean, there are places in America that are all white. There are places in America that are all black, all Hispanic, all, you know. And so I think we need to take it from the standpoint of this app could apply to any context, right? I think in the back of our mind, we have this context of Detroit, right? Maybe we do, maybe we don't, right? But I think if you take it at a much higher level, and maybe envision yourself as someone traveling to a new city, a new place. And the question that you would want to ask yourself, all things being equal, would I want to know? All things being equal, would I prefer to have this information?
I think so much of the response to that will depend on what you think of the statistics that it's based on to begin with. And there's a really excellent follow-up article in NPR last week about the results of like a several-year investigation into the New York Police Department manipulating their statistics. And the manipulations happen both ways. You have crimes that get downgraded in severity to make the precinct's numbers look better, and then you have more reports of like stop and frisk and very basic kind of misdemeanor crimes in areas with a lot of minorities. So the way that I view this app is that it's essentially taking what I perceive as a racist, or at the very least severely flawed data set, and then it's putting it in a situation where it's accessible to a lot more people, and they don't even think about where it's coming from, these issues of transparency that we're talking about. And I think because most of that data is so inherently flawed and, in my opinion, racist, it's like if you're re-disseminating racist data, it doesn't matter what you're dressing it up with, you're still ultimately just re-perpetuating that out into the world and confirming people's stereotypes. And I don't really feel like it's that safe even, because in a white neighborhood, a really severe crime may have been downgraded in order to preserve the statistics. So I don't really know that you can look at those and get any kind of accurate view of reality, except, well, this is these statistics that were made, and I don't really know what they mean about what it's actually like here.
There's a question behind you and one next to you, and some over here.
I think if you're talking about a higher level versus a lower level, right? The higher level is the higher level is this what she was talking about? Is this data set that's being distributed to a large audience discriminatory? That is the higher level, right? That's the sort of thing in the air that applies to everybody that maybe nobody is talking about. And also, I want to talk a little bit about, on the specific level, we have now personal computing that is, so an app, this concept of there's an app for that, right? And the individual consumer buying into a larger idea set. Like, what does it mean to be an iPhone user, right? Like, if you think about the Apple commercials with, like, the Mac guy and the PC guy, right? What does it mean to be the Mac guy? What is that? And just as an aside, I recently wrote a paper on the rise of personal computing, which happened in the 60s and the 70s, and is very tied in with these political movements for an individual voice, for this idea, personal computing, this idea of we can take what was previously this corporate mechanical machine and turn it into a medium for individual expression and to come around individual ideas. And there were all of these publications that brought together disparate, unhappy people to create movements, and it was really powerful. And so, having done this paper, now when I look at apps like this, and when I look at application development generally in the iPhone and the whole market, part of me is like, we're losing our roots. We're losing this idea that we can use personal computing to change the world socially in a positive way, and we're not paying attention to our responsibilities and our abilities to do that. And that, to me, is really saddening.
Yeah, and then coming over here.
Yeah, build up of that. When I think about being able to separate the app itself from the data that it's using, there is a lot of that promising idea. I taught on the Southwest side of Chicago for Teach for America, and when I told people where I taught, there was this cultural narrative of that's not a safe neighborhood, you shouldn't be there. But actually, the community had worked really hard to change its crime statistics, its educational outlook, and it wasn't an unsafe place for me to be. I was very safe there. But the cultural narrative in the greater city of Chicago hadn't changed to reflect the fact that this community had done a lot of work to improve. And I think crime statistics would have reflected that. So that's an opportunity. And maybe this is another opportunity for us to look again for the millionth time at a more critical way of looking at the data itself and putting the questions there instead of the questions on the app development.
Good point. Yes.
I think one of the things to remember is that data doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's throughout this discussion and talking about the wider discussion, and I say all of this, but there was that theme of it's just data versus how do you use the data. But we give data context, whether it's through the use of these apps. And one of the things, as just a person who's hopefully going into the field very soon, we work with personas and target users. So I wonder who target users are for these apps, because it's not people who live in the neighborhoods. I always wonder when you talk about these things. So what if this is your house? You're dead center in the bad neighborhood. What does that mean? The other thing is that you mentioned stop and frisks. The way the data is contextualized. How about an app for young Black and Latino men to know where not to go because the cops excessively stop and frisk? That's not the way this data is presented either. So there's a definite point of view there. The data is not in a vacuum. Even the developers who are like, gee whiz, shiny thing, are still coming at things from a cultural perspective. And I think that we as information professionals need to be aware of that perspective, and that those who don't have to be aware of that perspective are privileged. It's a form of privilege to not have to be aware of it.
I would like to add also that you have to ask the question yourself of what effect will these data have on me as a human being? Do I want access to these data? Whether they're clean or not? You know, what's the impact on me? And how will I perceive or change or decrease in sensitivity or whatever based on having this much access to these data? I'm not somebody who thinks that more data is better, obviously. Yes?
So it seems like people are really good at explaining why they're not racist. Like if that topic comes up or if the possibility of it is mentioned, there's typically an immediate and surprisingly detailed response. That's why no, it's not racist. And so I guess what I'm wondering is that based on that behavior, which I feel is kind of fundamental in a way, is there another way of bringing these issues up, like say with the developers or other people, to make them less defensive about it and think more about the larger scope of how it might affect people?
I could add something there if I may, and then there's, I think Dave has his hand up back. Was it you, Dave, or somebody? Okay. When we think of personal duties having to do with ethical values, we think about fostering trust. So you could ask yourself, you know, is this fostering trust in the community or among the users? We talk about acting with integrity, so we would ask ourselves about the integrity of the data. And we think about doing justice. Does this in some way promote justice, promote the doing of justice? And then I'll add one more, practicing beneficence and helping people to to have a positive effect on humans. So I mean, we could apply just those 4 out of many ethical values and ask ourselves up front early when we're looking at the possibilities of something cool. Is that something we really think we want to do?
So, talking about with the data, having problems with it and the app developers on top of it, and how we can talk about it together here in this school. Maybe we don't have a course specifically geared towards it, but there is discussion at the school about being choice architects and about assuming that our users are human and have imperfect information and have their own biases. Like how we structure the information for them actually will help guide their thinking. I'm thinking about the book Nudge, and how you can actually just nudge people towards making better decisions. But a lot of that comes from, like was brought up earlier, having good data to support that and like making sure that the data underlying it. So it behooves us to understand where our data is coming from, and that's like an important philosophy that should guide all of our structuring of the stuff that we build, is knowing where our data is coming from and knowing that our users are not necessarily going to go into the footnotes of our documents and be like, well, actually this data is kind of suspect, but I put it in here anyway. And you should know that. That's my disclaimer.
Well, also the reason then for more transparency, so the user can make a decision for themselves about it. Trophy?
I just want to point out to the fact that in IT community, usually IT people want to enumerate stuff. We want to quantize it, so it has to have a numerical quantity to it. But even if the statistics were accurate, how would you say that, well, if there was a scale and then there's a cutoff, so if anything were before the number 5, then this is a good neighborhood. Anything after 5 would be a bad neighborhood. What would that mean? Would it mean anything, real? That's my concern. I don't feel that there's a real meaning of the data itself.
Dave?
Just real quick, I think they've been really good comments, and I think the thing is that this notion about racism is like a binary, it's a 0 or a 1. I would make a claim that we're all screwed up around race in this country, and white people are defensive about it because they don't feel racist because they have kind of like a Ku Klux Klan notion of racism. And so, to John's point, I think the way if you accept that, and we all have baggage or we all have issues we have to deal with, but we never talk about it. The seems the thing is that for an information technology person designing these things, they can at least be self-aware of that issue and then move forward from there. At least think that maybe there's issues around race that are beyond what they're seeing, and at least be sensitive to that. And it's not that you're racist or not racist. It's like let's understand how we're all been shaped by this culture, and it's kind of invented our heads around race.
Or at least know that as part of your methodology, you have to bring people together and hear what their comments are going to be. For instance, in class, I thought somebody made a comment that if their neighborhood had been listed in this, they would really be hurt. And it hadn't occurred to me, that piece, but of course I know that that would be the case for me as well. So it's important to have these discussions and make sure they come up to the surface before you're going forward with your development.
I think one of the concerns about quantifying data is, I imagine a world of real estate agents who say your house is on the good side of the street, so it's going to be worth $20,000 more, and how, when we have a number that can be extrapolated into another number, it becomes a much more systemic problem than just, is my personal safety, but what about my financial security and the investments we've made?
Yes.
I was just going to potentially introduce a dimension here that hasn't gotten a lot of buzz, which is we've been talking about, is the act racist? Is this racist? And we're not looking at ourselves. And as information professionals, a subset of us will be out in the world working on projects, right? And we might be working on some of these sexy apps that do these wonderful things. And while it may be provocative and interesting to say, is the act racist or not, and even in retrospect say, wow, I didn't know that app could be thought of as racist. Perhaps another interesting question would be, okay, I have a problem with this personally. It doesn't align with my beliefs, with what's going on in the team. I need my job. I need to pay my bills. What do I do about it? What's the response to something that's wrong? Kind of to piggyback on this point here is to say, okay, how about looking at ourselves and saying, you're going to be in positions where you're going to be asked to do things that don't align with what you think the core of you is. And what's the response? In the context of having bills to pay and reputations to build or to sustain, what do you do then? So I think that that's an element here that I'd like to introduce.
So I think there's that's a good question. One of the things I would highlight, is that there's a fundamental difference between being asked to develop an application that maps, let's say, crime statistics versus fraud, right? Or engaging in activity that will defraud somebody, right? So I think from that standpoint, you have to ask yourself, right? Almost, the question is technology neutral? No, it's not neutral, but it's not inherently biased either, right? Almost any technology can be used for something that's bad. So I don't know, if you work for a company, I think it's important to ask the questions of the implications. I'm not sure, if you had that approach to a lot of things. If you were developing the internet and you had that approach, you could say, well, I'm going to quit the job because there's too many bad things that could happen when we use the internet, right? So I think we've got to be careful from defining what is something that's fundamentally fraud or crime or that from developing a tool that could always be used in a negative light.
Yeah, that's the law of unintended consequences. It's almost, in professional settings, it's almost never as direct, where you get to make a decision that my personal integrity is violated by this task that my supervisor has assigned to me. It's something else. It's good intents gone awry, outside of your control. And then maybe the question is, well, can you sleep at night 4 years later because you made a design decision on a team that then resulted in something else happening way down the road. It goes back to the intents of the designers of that app in the first place. It was probably benign and unknowing, and maybe part of our responsibility of information professionals as professionals is to continue the conversation, continue to rattle the cage, continue to open, even if we can't actually do anything specifically about the immediate thing that's in front of us, but the dialogue that we're having and the perspectives that we bring to the lack of neutrality of virtually everything involving technology. There's no such thing at any level. So that awareness is important, but it's never quite, I'm afraid we're probably rare, and we could be thankful if we ever are in a situation where we could say, no, I am not going to do that, and pat yourself on the back because you've exercised integrity over your pocketbook or something. It's so rare that kind of situation ever happens.
I agree with Paul, but I think that it's also important for you to know who you are.
Yeah.
to decide where your lines are and to realize that you need to stand up and speak and have your alternatives in line in case you need to leave. I once asked my staff to be as devious as they could possibly be in their thinking about technology so that we could anticipate the misuses and abuses that might occur here at the university. We could never be devious enough to come up to be ahead of it. So I think the first thing is to say the purpose for which the application was made, hopefully good intent, but also to know yourself and know how far you're willing to go.